The morning air bit sharply against Detective Inspector Sarah Matthews' face as she stood on the windswept promenade of Tenby, watching the waves crash against the ancient harbor walls. At 28, she had seen plenty of unusual assignments during her 6 years with Dive Poas Police, but nothing quite like this. The radio crackled to life on her shoulder. Control to D.I. Matthews. Royal Protection Unit confirming arrival time, 1400 hours. Weather forecast shows temperatures dropping to -2 Celsius with strong coastal winds. Sarah pressed the transmit button. Received. Control. All security checkpoints established. Local response teams in position. She pulled her heavy coat tighter and glanced at her watch. 11:30 in the morning, and already the small Welsh seaside town was buzzing with an energy she had never experienced. Word had spread quickly through the narrow medieval streets that Prince William, the Prince of Wales, will be making an unexpected visit to their community. What made this visit extraordinary was not just the short notice, but the weather conditions that would have sent most people indoors with hot tea and warm blankets. The temperature had plummeted overnight, leaving frost on the colorful Georgian houses that lined the seafront. The Welsh coastline, usually mild even in winter, was experiencing its coldest snap in decades. Yet here was the future King of England, insisting on continuing with his planned walkabout along Tenby's famous North Beach, despite urgent suggestions from his security team to move the engagement indoors. Sarah had been briefed 3 days earlier about the visit, though even then, the exact details remained fluid. The prince's private secretary had contacted the local council with a simple request. His Royal Highness wanted to experience a traditional Welsh coastal community during winter to understand better the challenges faced by residents and businesses during the off-season tourism months. But, Your Highness, she had overheard the Royal Protection Officer saying during a preliminary security sweep, the Meteorological Office is predicting the harshest conditions this coast has seen in 20 years. Perhaps we could arrange indoor venues, meet with community leaders in the town hall, visit some of the local museums. The prince's response had been characteristic of the man who had spent years in military service and never shied away from challenging conditions. If the people of Tenby live and work here through these conditions, then I should experience what they experience. How can I truly understand their lives from inside a heated building? Sarah admired that attitude, even as it complicated her job considerably. Securing an outdoor royal visit was complex under the best circumstances. Doing so, when the wind chill would drop the felt temperature well below freezing, added layers of difficulty she had never encountered. The local community had responded with typical Welsh warmth and determination. Mrs. Bronwyn Davies, who ran the small cafe overlooking the harbor, had been up since 4 in the morning preparing traditional Welsh cakes and bara brith. At 73, she had lived in Tenby her entire life and had never imagined she would serve tea to a Prince of Wales. My grandmother used to tell stories about the old princes who ruled Wales, she had told Sarah during the security briefing the previous day. She would say they were men who knew the land, who understood the sea and the seasons. To have our Prince William come here in such weather, it shows he has that same spirit. The weather had indeed become the talk of the entire county. Local meteorologist James Hinley from the Pembrokeshire Weather Station had been tracking the approaching system for days. We're looking at a perfect storm of conditions, he explained to the gathered media who had begun arriving despite the challenging circumstances. Arctic air mass moving down from Iceland, colliding with moisture from the Atlantic. The result is not just cold temperatures, but sustained winds that will make the actual feeling much more severe. Yet as Sarah watched from her position near the lifeboat station, she could see people beginning to gather despite the conditions. Families with children bundled in multiple layers, elderly residents who had walked carefully down the steep streets despite the risk of ice, young couples who had driven from Cardiff and Swansea just for the chance to see their prince in person. The Royal Protection Team had arrived at dawn, led by Inspector David Morgan, a 35-year veteran who had protected 3 generations of the royal family. Sarah had worked with protection units before, but never at this level and never under such circumstances. The challenge, Inspector Morgan had explained during their final briefing, is maintaining security protocols while allowing genuine community interaction. His Royal Highness specifically requested that we not create barriers between him and the people. He wants this to feel natural, spontaneous, even though obviously every moment must be carefully managed. The advance team had spent 2 days walking every inch of the proposed route, from the harbor up through the town center along the medieval walls, and then down in North Beach where the prince would spend time talking with local businesses, fishermen, and families. The route would expose the royal party to the full force of the coastal winds, but there seemed to be no deterring the prince from his intention. Local council leader Margaret Williams had initially worried about the logistics. "How do we make this work?" she had asked during an emergency planning session. "We want to show His Royal Highness the best of our community, but we also need to keep everyone safe. These aren't normal conditions." The solution had come from the community itself. Local businesses offered their premises as warming stations. The Tenby Museum agreed to stay open with hot drinks for anyone who needed shelter. The RNLI volunteered crew members to help with crowd management and safety. The town came together with the kind of collective effort that Sarah had seen before during emergencies, but rarely for such a positive occasion. 3 days of intensive planning had followed. Road closures had to be coordinated with minimal disruption to local residents. Media positions needed to be established that would allow coverage while maintaining security. Most challenging of all, contingency plans had to be developed for weather conditions that could change rapidly. If the wind speed exceeds 40 miles per hour, we move to indoor venues immediately, Inspector Morgan had insisted. If visibility drops due to snow or sleet, we have alternative routes prepared. And if anyone shows signs of hypothermia, including His Royal Highness, we have medical teams standing by. The medical preparations have been extensive. Dr. Elizabeth Roberts, the local GP who had volunteered to be on standby, had briefed the team on cold weather risks. Hypothermia can set in quickly in these conditions, especially with the wind chill. We need to watch for early signs: shivering that stops suddenly, confusion, loss of coordination. I'll have warming equipment at 3 stations along the route. As Sarah stood watching the final preparations, she reflected on how this visit had already brought the community together in ways that surprised everyone involved. The local primary school had made banners despite being closed for the day due to heating problems. The youth rugby team had volunteered to help with crowd control, seeing it as an honor to serve during such an important occasion. The local fishermen, men who knew these waters and this weather better than anyone, had offered their expertise on timing. "The tide will be right around 2 o'clock, Captain Tom Jenkins had told the planning committee. "Wind usually drops a bit then. Give you maybe an hour of the best conditions you're going to get today." Sarah's radio crackled again. "All units, this is Control. Royal Convoy departed Cardiff at 11:45. Estimated arrival in Tenby at 13:30 hours. Weather update. Current temperature -1 Celsius. Wind speed 32 miles per hour from the northwest, gusting to 45. She took a deep breath of the sharp, salty air and checked her equipment one final time. Radio, emergency medical kit, thermal blankets, mobile phone with direct lines to the control room, and medical team. Around her, the other members of the security team were making similar final checks. The people of Tenby continued to gather despite the harsh conditions. Sarah could see determination on their faces that matched the prince's own resolve. These were people who had lived with the Welsh weather all their lives, who understood both its beauty and its challenges. They were not going to let a bit of cold prevent them from welcoming their prince properly. Mrs. Davies emerged from her cafe, carrying a thermos, and walked carefully across the icy pavement towards Sarah. "Thought you might need something warm, love," she said with a kind smile. "It's going to be a long afternoon, and you'll need to keep your strength up." Sarah accepted the hot tea gratefully. This was exactly the kind of Welsh hospitality that the prince would experience in just a few hours. It was this warmth of spirit that could overcome any amount of cold weather, and she suspected that was exactly what His Royal Highness hoped to discover during his visit to this special corner of Wales. The wind picked up again, sending spray from the harbor across the promenade, but Sarah noticed that more people were arriving every minute. whatever challenges the weather might bring. The people of Tenby were ready to give their prince the warm welcome he deserved. The black Range Rover appeared around the corner at precisely 1:35 in the afternoon, followed by 2 police motorcycles and a second security vehicle. Despite the freezing wind that had been battering Tenby all morning, several hundred people had gathered along the designated route, their faces red from the cold, but their spirits undimmed. 8-year-old Emily Thomas pressed closer to the barrier, clutching a small Welsh flag that her grandmother had given her. Her mother, Helen, kept adjusting Emily's scarf and hat, making sure her daughter stayed warm while they waited. They had traveled from Carmarthen that morning specifically to see the prince, despite her husband's concerns about the weather. "Mummy, will the prince be cold too?" Emily asked, her breath visible in small puffs as she spoke. "I think so, sweetheart," Helen replied, pulling her own coat tighter. "But sometimes important people have to do difficult things, even when it's not comfortable." 3 vehicles away from the barrier, local fisherman Captain Tom Jenkins stood with several members of his crew. These were men who went out on the Irish Sea in all weather, who understood better than most what it meant to work in harsh conditions. Tom had been fishing these waters for 40 years and had never seen a member of the royal family visit during such extreme weather. "Takes courage, this does," he murmured to his first mate, David Evans. Most politicians would have canceled, moved it indoors, made excuses about health and safety. This one's different. The convoy slowed as it approached the harbor area where the official welcome would take place. Through the reinforced windows of the lead vehicle, Prince William could see the crowds that had gathered despite the brutal conditions. He had been watching the weather reports throughout the journey from Cardiff, and his security team had made 3 separate attempts to convince him to modify the visit. "Your Royal Highness," Inspector Morgan had said over the secure radio system, "current conditions are genuinely dangerous. Wind chill is taking the effective temperature to -8 Celsius. We strongly recommend limiting outdoor exposure to no more than 10 minutes at each stop." William had listened thoughtfully to each recommendation, but his response remained unchanged. "Inspector, these people have come out in these same conditions to welcome me. Some of them are children, elderly residents who have made real effort to be here. I'm not going to hide in a warm building while they stand in the cold." As the motorcade came to a stop, the prince could see the full extent of the gathering. Local dignitaries stood in a formal receiving line, but beyond them stretched an impressive crowd of ordinary families, workers from the local tourist industry, students from a nearby college, and retired residents who had lived in Tenby for decades. The sight strengthened his resolve to make this visit meaningful despite the challenging conditions. Detective Inspector Sarah Matthews moved into position as the Royal Protection Team began their practiced routine of exit procedures. She could see the genuine excitement on the faces in the crowd, but also noted the way people were stamping their feet and rubbing their hands together to maintain circulation. Medical teams were positioned strategically throughout the area, ready to respond if anyone showed signs of cold-related distress. The car door opened, and Prince William stepped out into the full force of the Welsh coastal wind. The impact was immediate and visible even to those watching from a distance. His coat whipped around him, and he had to steady himself slightly against the vehicle. But instead of retreating or showing any sign of discomfort, he smiled broadly and raised his hand in acknowledgement of the crowd's enthusiastic cheers. Margaret Williams, the council leader who would be making the formal introduction, stepped forward. She had been practicing her brief remarks for days, but now found herself struggling against the wind that seemed determined to steal her words before they could reach the prince's ears. "Your Royal Highness," she began, raising her voice to carry over the gale, "on behalf of the people of Tenby, we welcome you to our town. We are deeply honored that you have chosen to visit us, especially under such challenging conditions." The prince leaned slightly closer to hear her clearly, his attention focused entirely on her words despite the distraction of the weather. "Mrs. Williams, thank you so much for organizing this visit. I specifically wanted to come during winter because I believe this is when communities show their true character. What I see here today confirms everything I hope to discover about the spirit of the Welsh people. From her position behind the barriers, Mrs. Bronwyn Davies watched the exchange with growing admiration. She had been skeptical when first told about the visit, wondering whether this was just another political appearance, a brief photo opportunity that would inconvenience local people for no real benefit. But watching the prince engage genuinely with Mrs. Williams while the wind threatened to knock them both sideways, she began to understand that this was something different. The formal introductions continued as planned, but with an informality imposed by the weather that seemed to put everyone at ease. When Councillor James Roberts stepped forward to shake hands with the prince, a particularly strong gust of wind caught his carefully prepared speech notes, sending them spinning across the harbor area. Instead of embarrassment, this prompted genuine laughter from the prince and the gathered crowd. I think nature is telling us to keep this brief and focus on what really matters, the prince said warmly, extending his hand to Councillor Roberts. Tell me about your community, about the people who live and work here through seasons like this. This simple question opened a conversation that immediately moved beyond formal protocol. Councillor Roberts, a lifelong Tenby resident, found himself talking naturally about the challenges and rewards of life in a coastal community that depended heavily on seasonal tourism, but remained vibrant year-round through the determination and creativity of its people. The winter months test us, he explained, having to raise his voice as the wind continued its assault. Businesses that thrive in summer have to find ways to survive when the tourists go home. But we support each other. We find innovative ways to bring people here during the quiet months, and we never lose sight of what makes this place special. The prince listened intently, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated he understood the economic realities facing small coastal communities across the United Kingdom. His questions were specific and informed, clearly the result of preparation that went well beyond superficial briefing notes. As they spoke, Detective Inspector Sarah Matthews noticed something remarkable happening in the crowd. Despite the increasingly harsh conditions, not only were people not leaving, but more were arriving. She watched families making their way carefully down the steep streets, elderly residents being helped by younger neighbors, teenagers who had clearly walked significant distances to be part of this occasion. Young Emily Thomas was beginning to show signs of real cold, her cheeks bright red and her small body shivering despite her layers of warm clothing. Her mother was about to suggest they move to one of the warming stations when something unexpected happened. The prince, having completed the formal introductions, began moving toward the crowd barriers for the planned walkabout. As he approached, he noticed Emily immediately, perhaps drawn by her determined grip on the Welsh flag despite her obvious discomfort. "Hello there," he said, crouching down at her level despite the fact that this put him in an even more exposed position relative to the wind. "That's a beautiful flag you have. Did you come far to be here today?" Emily's shyness disappeared instantly. "We came from Carmarthen, Your Royal Highness. Mummy said you were brave to come here when it's so cold." The prince's face lit up with genuine delight. "Well, I think you're very brave too, standing out here in this weather to welcome me. Do you know what? I think everyone here today is showing real Welsh courage." Helen Thomas watched this exchange with growing amazement. She had expected perhaps a brief wave, a moment of distant acknowledgement. Instead, here was the future King of England having a real conversation with her daughter while the wind howled around them and the temperature continued to drop. The prince continued along the barrier, stopping to talk with person after person despite the conditions that would have driven most people indoors. He spoke with Captain Tom Jenkins about the challenges of winter fishing, asking detailed questions about how weather patterns affected both safety and economic viability. He spent several minutes with a group of local shop owners, listening to their strategies for maintaining businesses during the off-season months. At each interaction, his attention seemed completely focused on the person he was speaking with, as though the harsh weather was simply irrelevant to what he considered his primary responsibility: connecting with the people who had made the effort to welcome him. Dr. Elizabeth Roberts, monitoring the situation from her position near the medical station, found herself impressed not just by the prince's determination to continue, but by his apparent awareness of the crowd's welfare. She noticed that he consistently positioned himself to shield others from the worst of the wind during conversations, and that he seemed to be keeping each individual interaction brief enough to minimize their exposure while still making them meaningful. After 30 minutes of meeting people along the harbor area, the time had come to move to the next phase of the visit, the walk along North Beach that everyone knew would be the real test of endurance for all involved. Inspector Morgan approached the prince with obvious reluctance. "Your Royal Highness, the conditions on the beach will be significantly more severe than here in the harbor area. We have no windbreaks, no shelter, and the temperature continues to drop. Are you certain you wish to proceed?" The prince looked out toward the beach where he could see the waves crashing with impressive force, sending spray high into the air where it was immediately caught and distributed by the relentless wind. Then he looked back at the crowd, many of whom were clearly preparing to follow the route despite the challenging conditions ahead. "Inspector," he said quietly, "look at these people. They're not asking to go indoors. They're not complaining about the weather. They're showing me what it means to be Welsh, to be resilient, to face difficulties with dignity and strength. How can I do less than meet their example?" With that decision made, the royal party began the careful descent toward North Beach, followed by hundreds of people who had chosen to experience this extraordinary day regardless of what the Welsh weather might throw at them. The moment Prince William's feet touched the sand of North Beach, the full force of the Atlantic weather hit the royal party with an intensity that made their previous exposure seem mild by comparison. Here, with no buildings or harbor walls to provide even minimal shelter, the wind roared off the Irish Sea carrying salt spray that stung exposed skin and created visibility challenges that tested even the experienced protection team. Detective Inspector Sarah Matthews had to lean into the wind to maintain her position, her radio barely audible above the natural symphony of crashing waves and howling gusts. Through her earpiece, she could hear the weather station's latest update. Wind speed now sustained at 42 miles per hour, gusting to 55. Temperature -3 Celsius, wind chill bringing effective temperature to -11. Yet Prince William strode onto the beach as though he were taking a pleasant summer stroll. His protection team moved in closer formation than usual, not just for security, but to help shield him from the worst of the horizontal spray that was now coating everything in a thin layer of ice. But the prince seemed almost energized by the extreme conditions, his pace steady and his attention focused on the small groups of people who had followed him onto this exposed stretch of Welsh coastline. Among those brave enough to venture onto the beach were members of the Tenby Surf Life Saving Club, led by their captain, 26-year-old Marcus Davies. These young people trained in these waters year-round, understanding better than most what it meant to respect both the power and the beauty of the Welsh coast in winter conditions. "Your Royal Highness," Marcus called out as the prince approached their group, "we want to show you what makes this beach special, even in weather like this." The prince stopped, immediately giving Marcus his full attention despite the fact that conversation required real effort in the face of the howling wind. "I can certainly see why it would take special people to train here in conditions like these. How do you manage it?" Marcus gestured toward his team members, all of whom were showing remarkable resilience despite being exposed to conditions that would challenge Arctic explorers. "It's about understanding the sea, Your Royal Highness, respecting it but not being afraid of it. The worst conditions are often when people need us most, so we have to be ready for anything." This simple statement seemed to resonate deeply with the prince. Here were young people who had chosen to dedicate themselves to serving others, who trained in harsh conditions not for personal glory, but because they understood that courage and preparation could mean the difference between life and death for those in distress. "Tell me about your training," the prince said, clearly prepared to continue the conversation despite the increasingly challenging conditions. What followed was a 20-minute discussion that became legendary among those present. Standing in sub-zero wind chill, with waves crashing just meters away and salt spray creating an almost Arctic environment, Prince William engaged in detailed conversation about water rescue techniques, community safety programs, and the challenges of maintaining volunteer emergency services in small coastal communities. Dr. Elizabeth Roberts, monitoring the situation from her mobile medical station, found herself checking her watch with growing concern. 40 minutes of exposure to these conditions was approaching the limits of safety for anyone, regardless of their physical condition or determination. She could see signs of real cold stress in several members of the crowd, and she knew that hypothermia could set in quickly once the body's core temperature began to drop. But when she looked at the prince, she saw something that surprised her professional judgment. Rather than showing signs of distress or fatigue, he appeared to be drawing energy from the extreme nature of the situation. His conversation with the surf life-saving team had attracted other groups, and what had begun as a brief beach walkabout was developing into an impromptu community gathering under some of the harshest conditions anyone present had ever experienced. Local photographer James Wheeler, who had covered countless royal visits over his 30-year career, struggled to operate his camera equipment in conditions that threatened to freeze both the mechanical components and his own fingers. Yet he knew he was witnessing something unprecedented in his experience of royal engagements. "I've never seen anything like this," he muttered to his assistant, who was helping shield equipment from a spray. "Most visits are so controlled, so predictable. This is real. This is happening right now, in conditions that are genuinely testing everyone involved." The prince had moved on to speak with a group of local business owners who had braved the beach to meet him. Among them was Robert Evans, who owned a small adventure tourism company that offered guided walks and outdoor experiences throughout Pembrokeshire. Robert had been struggling to maintain his business during the challenging economic conditions affecting the tourism industry, and he had almost decided not to attend the royal visit, feeling that his small operation was insignificant compared to the larger businesses that would be represented. "Your Royal Highness," Robert began hesitantly, "I run a small outdoor education company. We try to help people experience the Welsh coastline safely, to understand what makes this landscape so special." The prince's response was immediate and engaged. "That sounds like exactly the kind of work that makes a real difference to communities like this. How do you help people connect with this environment?" Robert found himself explaining his passion for the Welsh coast, describing how he guided families and school groups to understand the geology, the wildlife, the history that made this stretch of coastline unique. As he talked, the prince asked increasingly specific questions that demonstrated genuine interest and understanding of both the opportunities and challenges in outdoor education. "The difficulty," Robert admitted, "is that people often want the beautiful weather experience. They want the picture postcard whales, not the reality of what this place is like when nature shows its power." The prince gestured broadly at the scene around them. The crashing waves, the people standing firm against the howling wind, the dramatic landscape that was simultaneously beautiful and intimidating. "But this is magnificent," he said with obvious sincerity. "This is Wales at its most authentic. Anyone can visit a beach on a sunny day, but this takes real character." This exchange was overheard by several people in the surrounding group, and word began to spread through the gathered crowd about the prince's reaction to the extreme conditions. Far from seeing the weather as an obstacle or an inconvenience, he was embracing it as an essential part of understanding what made this place and its people special. 12-year-old Morgan Phillips, who had walked down to the beach with his grandfather despite his parents' concerns about the conditions, found himself close enough to hear much of the prince's conversation with the business owners. Morgan's grandfather, Di Phillips, was a retired coal miner who had spent his working life in conditions that most people would consider impossible, and he had wanted his grandson to witness what he considered a historic moment in their community's history. "Granddad," Morgan whispered, "why is the prince staying so long? Isn't he cold?" Di looked down at his grandson with eyes that had seen decades of Welsh weather and Welsh character. "Because, boy, this is what leadership looks like. Real leadership. He's showing us that he's willing to experience what we experience, to understand our lives not just from comfortable distance, but by sharing our challenges." As if to emphasize Di's point, Prince William noticed the elderly man and his grandson and made his way over to them. The protection team moved carefully to maintain their formation while allowing the prince the freedom to engage naturally with the crowd. "I hope you're both staying warm enough," the prince said, having to lean closer to be heard over the wind. "I'm impressed that so many people have chosen to come out in these conditions." Dai straightened to his full height, a gesture of respect that came naturally after decades of working-class dignity. "Your Royal Highness, we Welsh people don't let a bit of weather stop us from doing what's important. And welcoming our prince is important." The sincerity and simple eloquence of this statement seemed to affect the prince deeply. Here was a man who had probably faced more genuinely difficult conditions than most people could imagine, treating this extreme weather as simply another day that required determination and community spirit. "Sir," the prince replied, "I think you and your community are teaching me something important today about resilience and authentic welcome. This is exactly the kind of Welsh spirit that makes me proud to serve as Prince of Wales." Young Morgan Phillips would remember this moment for the rest of his life, standing on a freezing beach in conditions that challenged everyone present, watching the future King of England speak with his grandfather as one person of character recognizing another. The crowd on the beach had grown rather than diminished despite the worsening conditions. People were arriving in small groups, families, and individuals who had heard about what was happening and decided that this was too significant an occasion to miss, regardless of the weather. They came prepared with extra layers, thermoses of hot drinks, and the kind of determination that seemed to characterize this entire extraordinary day. Inspector David Morgan approached the prince with obvious reluctance, knowing that his next recommendation would not be welcomed. "Your Royal Highness, we've been exposed to extreme conditions for over an hour now. The medical team is expressing serious concerns about hypothermia risk for both yourself and the crowd. We really must consider moving to indoor venues." The prince looked around at the people who continued to gather, at the surf life-saving team who showed no signs of wanting to end their conversation, at families like the Phillips who had made genuine sacrifices to be part of this moment. "Inspector," he said thoughtfully, "I understand your concerns, and I appreciate the medical team's vigilance. But look around us. These people aren't asking to go indoors. They're showing me something about what it means to be Welsh that I could never learn in a heated building. Give me 30 more minutes to properly honor their effort." Those 30 minutes would become the most talked-about portion of an already extraordinary visit, as Prince William continued to engage with his future subjects under conditions that tested everyone's limits and revealed the true character of both the prince and the people of Tenby. Just as Prince William was concluding his conversation with the surf life-saving team, an unexpected situation developed that would transform an already remarkable royal visit into something that none of the participants would ever forget. The sound came first, a sharp blast from the emergency whistle of the Tenby RNLI station, followed immediately by the deep rumble of the lifeboat engines starting up. Marcus Davies, the surf life-saving captain who had been speaking with the prince, immediately snapped to attention. His trained ear recognized the emergency signals, and his eyes automatically swept the churning waters beyond the harbor entrance. What he saw made his blood run cold despite the freezing conditions. "Your Royal Highness," he said urgently, "there's a boat in distress out there. Small fishing vessel. Looks like engine failure in these conditions." Through the spray and wind-driven rain, the outline of a small boat was barely visible, clearly struggling against waves that were becoming more dangerous by the hour. The vessel was being pushed steadily toward the rocky outcropping that marked the hazardous northern edge of Tenby's coastal waters. Inspector David Morgan immediately moved closer to the prince, his protection instincts taking over. "Your Royal Highness, we need to move you to a safe location immediately. This type of emergency situation creates unpredictable crowd dynamics and potential risks." But Prince William, instead of moving toward the safety of the waiting vehicles, stepped closer to Marcus Davies and his team. "What can be done to help them?" he asked, his voice cutting through the wind with an intensity that surprised everyone within hearing range. The lifeboat crew is launching now, Marcus replied, pointing toward the harbor where the bright orange RNLI vessel was already moving purposefully toward the harbor mouth. But in these conditions, with these waves, it's going to be extremely challenging. Every minute counts when someone's in the water in temperatures like this. The prince's response was immediate and completely unexpected. Is there anything we can do from here to assist the rescue operation? Detective Inspector Sarah Matthews felt her heart rate spike as she realized the direction this conversation was taking. Her job was to keep the prince safe, not to facilitate his involvement in active emergency situations. But she also recognized that they were witnessing something unprecedented, a member of the royal family asking how he could help during a real crisis rather than seeking safety and distance. Marcus Davies looked at the prince with new respect, understanding that this was not merely curiosity, but a genuine offer of assistance from someone who clearly understood the seriousness of the situation. Your Royal Highness, the best thing anyone can do right now is help coordinate the onshore response. If they get people off that boat, they'll need immediate medical attention for hypothermia and potential injuries. Dr. Elizabeth Roberts, who had been monitoring the royal visit from her medical station, suddenly found her role dramatically expanded. She quickly approached the group, her professional instincts taking precedence over royal protocol. Your Royal Highness, she said, slightly out of breath from hurrying across the uneven beach surface, I'm Dr. Roberts, the medical officer for today's visit. We have full emergency medical equipment here, and I can coordinate with the ambulance service if casualties need to be transported to hospital. The prince turned to her with the kind of focused attention that military officers would recognize. Doctor, what do you need to be ready for potential hypothermia victims? Immediate warming, sir. Dry clothing, thermal blankets, warm beverages if they're conscious and able to swallow safely. The critical thing is getting core body temperature stabilized as quickly as possible. What happened next surprised everyone present, including the Royal Protection Team. Instead of accepting evacuation to a safe location, Prince William began actively coordinating the onshore emergency response. He asked Marcus Davies to position his surf life-saving team along the beach where the lifeboat would most likely bring any rescued persons. He requested that Dr. Roberts establish a medical triage area in the most sheltered spot available. He even asked Inspector Morgan to coordinate with local emergency services to ensure clear access routes for ambulances. Within minutes, what had been a royal walkabout had transformed into an impromptu emergency response center, with the future King of England serving as an active coordinator rather than a passive observer requiring protection. The crowd that had gathered to see the prince found themselves witnessing something far more significant than a traditional royal visit. They watched as their future monarch demonstrated practical leadership under genuine pressure, organizing resources and people with the kind of calm efficiency that spoke of real experience and training. Mrs. Bronwyn Davies, the cafe owner who had been following the royal party along the beach despite the harsh conditions, found herself recruited to help with the emergency response. Can you get hot tea and soup ready for people who might be suffering from cold exposure? The prince asked her directly. Of course, Your Royal Highness, she replied, immediately understanding the seriousness of the situation. I'll have everything ready in 5 minutes. As she hurried back toward her cafe, Mrs. Davies reflected on the extraordinary nature of what was happening. Here was a royal visit that had become a real test of leadership, and their prince was rising to that test in ways that exceeded anything she had hoped to see. The RNLI lifeboat had reached the distressed vessel, and through binoculars provided by the Coast Guard station, observers on shore could see the difficult rescue operation beginning. The fishing boat, later identified as the Mary Catherine out of Saundersfoot with 3 crew members aboard, had suffered complete engine failure and was taking on water in seas that were becoming increasingly dangerous. Captain Tom Jenkins, the experienced fisherman who had been speaking with the prince earlier, positioned himself near the royal group to provide expert commentary on what was happening offshore. They're trying to get a line across, he reported, squinting through the spray. Difficult work in these conditions. The lifeboat crew knows what they're doing, but this is about as challenging as it gets. Prince William listened intently to Captain Jenkins' assessment, asking questions that demonstrated understanding of maritime rescue operations that went well beyond casual interest. It became clear to those present that this was not theoretical knowledge, but practical understanding gained through military service and training. "How long before we know if they can get them off safely?" the prince asked. "Next 10 minutes will tell the story," Captain Jenkins replied grimly. "If they can't establish the line connection soon, they'll have to try a different approach, and that gets more dangerous for everyone involved." Young Emily Thomas, who had been watching the royal visit with her mother, now found herself witnessing something that would shape her understanding of leadership and service for years to come. Despite the cold that had been making her miserable, she was completely absorbed in watching Prince William coordinate the emergency response. "Mummy," she whispered, "why is the prince helping with the boat rescue?" Her mother, Helen, struggled to find words adequate to explain what they were witnessing. "Because, sweetheart, this is what real leadership looks like. When people need help, good leaders don't worry about their own comfort or safety. They do whatever they can to help." The tension on the beach was palpable as everyone watched the rescue operation unfold. The Royal Protection Team had established a wider security perimeter, but they had also adapted their procedures to accommodate the prince's insistence on remaining actively involved in the emergency response coordination. Inspector Morgan found himself in the unusual position of having to balance his protective responsibilities with his growing recognition that this crisis was revealing something important about the character of the man he was assigned to protect. Rather than seeking safety, Prince William was demonstrating exactly the kind of leadership under pressure that the British people hoped to see from their future monarch. Dr. Roberts had established her medical triage area and was coordinating with the ambulance service when she received word that the lifeboat had successfully made contact with the distressed fishing vessel. "They've got a line across," she announced to the group. "They're preparing to transfer the crew members now." The prince immediately moved to a position where he could observe the final phase of the rescue operation while remaining close enough to the medical area to assist if needed. His protection team adjusted their positions accordingly, recognizing that conventional protocols had to be modified for this unprecedented situation. The next 20 minutes would test everyone's endurance, skill, and character as the rescue operation reached its critical phase, and Prince William continued to demonstrate that his commitment to service extended far beyond ceremonial appearances and comfortable indoor meetings. The orange RNLI lifeboat appeared through the spray and towering waves, moving steadily toward the beach with its precious cargo of 3 rescued fishermen from the Mary Catherine. From their position on North Beach, Prince William and the gathered crowd could see that the rescue had been successful, but it was also clear that the ordeal had taken its toll on the survivors who had spent nearly 2 hours battling impossible conditions before help could reach them. Dr. Elizabeth Roberts stood ready with her medical equipment, flanked by 2 paramedics who had arrived from the local ambulance service. The thermal blankets and warming equipment that had been intended as precautionary measures for the royal visit were now serving their intended purpose in a real emergency situation. "Your Royal Highness," Dr. Roberts called out as the lifeboat approached the shore, "the first priority will be assessing for hypothermia and treating any injuries from the boat damage. These men will have been exposed to extreme conditions for an extended period." Prince William nodded, his attention completely focused on the approaching rescue vessel. "What can I do to help, Doctor?" The question surprised the medical team, who had expected the prince to observe from a safe distance rather than offer direct assistance. Dr. Roberts quickly considered the situation and made a decision that would be discussed in emergency response circles for years to come. "If you're willing, sir, having an additional pair of hands to help with warming procedures and getting the men to shelter would be invaluable. But I must warn you, this will involve close contact with people who are likely to be in significant medical distress." "Doctor," the prince replied without hesitation, "I've had military medical training. Please tell me what you need me to do." As the lifeboat reached the shore, the full extent of the rescued fishermen's ordeal became apparent. The 3 men, later identified as David Morgan, age 52, his son James Morgan, 28, and crew member Peter Williams, 45, were conscious but showing clear signs of severe cold exposure and exhaustion. The RNLI crew worked with practiced efficiency to transfer the men from the lifeboat to the beach, where Dr. Roberts and her team immediately began assessment procedures. Prince William, without regard for royal protocol or personal comfort, took an active role in helping to move the men to the sheltered medical area that had been hastily established. Marcus Davies and his surf life-saving team provided crucial assistance, their experience with cold water emergencies proving invaluable in the rescue aftermath. The sight of the future King of England working alongside local volunteers to provide emergency medical care created a scene that no one present would ever forget. "Easy there," Prince William said quietly to David Morgan, the eldest of the rescued fishermen, as they helped him toward the warming station. "You're safe now. We're going to get you warmed up and checked out by the doctor." David Morgan, despite his ordeal, recognized the voice and the face of the man helping him. "Your Royal Highness?" he asked weakly, confusion evident in his voice. "What are you doing here?" "Right now, I'm just someone helping to make sure you're all right," the prince replied, his focus entirely on getting the man to medical care rather than on the extraordinary nature of the circumstances. Dr. Roberts worked quickly to assess the three fishermen, finding that while all showed signs of hypothermia and exhaustion, none had suffered life-threatening injuries. The youngest, James Morgan, had sustained a minor head injury when the boat had been thrown against the rocks, but examination showed no signs of serious trauma. Mrs. Bronwyn Davies arrived with thermoses of hot soup and tea, fulfilling the role she had been asked to play in the emergency response. She found herself serving refreshments not just to the rescued fishermen, but to the prince and the entire emergency response team who had been working in brutal conditions for over an hour. "Your Royal Highness," she said as she offered him a cup of hot tea, "in 40 years of living in Tenby, I've never seen anything like what happened here today." The prince accepted the tea gratefully, his hands showing the same redness from cold exposure that affected everyone who had been on the beach during the emergency. "Mrs. Davies, what I've seen today is exactly what makes Wales special. When people needed help, this entire community stepped forward without hesitation. That's true Welsh character." As the rescued fishermen were stabilized and prepared for transport to the local hospital for further observation, word of what had happened began to spread beyond the immediate area. News outlets that had come to cover a routine royal visit found themselves reporting on something far more significant: a future monarch who had demonstrated genuine leadership under pressure and personal courage in service of others. Inspector David Morgan approached the prince as the emergency situation wound down, knowing that he needed to address the unprecedented nature of what had just occurred. "Your Royal Highness, I need to report that you have just been involved in an active emergency response situation that exposed you to significant personal risk. This will require a full briefing for the Palace Security Office." Prince William looked at the inspector with a slight smile. "Inspector, I understand your concerns, and I appreciate your diligence throughout this entire day. But what happened here today wasn't about risk management. It was about doing what needed to be done when people were in danger." The crowd that had remained on the beach throughout the entire ordeal burst into spontaneous applause as the last of the rescued fishermen was loaded into the ambulance for transport. But the applause wasn't just for the successful rescue operation. It was recognition of having witnessed something extraordinary in terms of royal leadership and community response. Young Emily Thomas, who had watched the entire sequence of events from her position near the medical area, tugged on her mother's coat. "Mummy, the prince helped save those men, didn't he?" Helen Thomas, who was still processing what she had witnessed, knelt down to her daughter's level. "Yes, sweetheart. Today we saw what it really means to serve others, no matter who you are or what position you hold." As the emergency vehicles departed and the immediate crisis passed, Prince William insisted on continuing with the remainder of his planned visit. Despite having been exposed to extreme weather conditions for nearly 3 hours, including the intense stress of coordinating an emergency response, he remained determined to meet with the people who had waited to see him. The final hour of the visit took on a character unlike any royal engagement in recent memory. Conversations were deeper, more meaningful, touched by the shared experience of having faced genuine challenges together. People spoke more openly, and the prince's responses showed a level of engagement and authenticity that reflected the extraordinary circumstances they had all navigated. Captain Tom Jenkins, who had provided expert commentary during the rescue operation, found himself in conversation with the prince about the realities of life in coastal communities that depended on both the sea and the weather for their livelihoods. "Your Royal Highness," Captain Jenkins said, "what you did today, staying here, helping with the rescue, working alongside ordinary people, that's the kind of leadership we've been hoping to see." The prince's response was characteristically thoughtful. "Captain Jenkins, what I learned today came from all of you. You showed me what real courage looks like, what genuine community spirit means. I should be thanking you for the education." As the official visit drew to a close, the temperature had dropped even further, and the wind showed no signs of diminishing. Yet the crowd that gathered for the prince's departure was larger than the one that had welcomed him hours earlier. Word had spread throughout Tenby and the surrounding communities about what had transpired, and people continued to arrive to be part of this historic occasion. Dr. Elizabeth Roberts, who had coordinated the medical response throughout the day, approached the prince with a final assessment. "Your Royal Highness, from a medical standpoint, you've been exposed to dangerous conditions for an extended period. You should seek shelter and warming as soon as possible." "Doctor," the prince replied, "I'll follow your medical advice, but I want you to know that today has been one of the most meaningful experiences of my service as Prince of Wales. Thank you for your professionalism and your willingness to let me be part of the emergency response." The departure ceremony was brief, recognition that everyone present had endured extraordinary conditions and needed to seek warmth and shelter. But the impact of the visit would resonate far beyond the immediate participants. In the weeks that followed, the story of Prince William's visit to Tenby would be retold countless times. But those who had been present knew that the simple retellings could never capture the full significance of what they had witnessed. They had seen authentic leadership under pressure, genuine service in the face of personal risk, and a demonstration of the values that define both Welsh character and royal duty at its finest. The rescued fishermen, David Morgan, James Morgan, and Peter Williams, would recover fully from their ordeal. But they would carry for the rest of their lives the memory of being helped to safety by the future King of England, who had chosen to place service to others above personal comfort or conventional protocol. For the people of Tenby, the visit became a source of immense pride and a benchmark for what authentic leadership could accomplish. The prince had not simply visited their community. He had joined it, shared its challenges, and demonstrated through his actions the kind of character they hoped to see in their future monarch. And for Prince William himself, the visit represented a defining moment in his understanding of what it meant to serve as Prince of Wales. He had discovered that genuine connection with the Welsh people required more than ceremonial appearances or comfortable meetings. It demanded a willingness to share their experiences, to face their challenges, and to demonstrate through personal action the values of courage, service, and community that define the best of Welsh character. The freezing temperatures, the brutal wind, and the emergency that had tested everyone's limits had created exactly the kind of authentic experience the prince had hoped to find. In the warmth of the Welsh welcome that persevered despite the harsh conditions, he had found not just understanding of his role, but inspiration for the leader he aspired to become.